Good morning, everybody. Fun to be back here with y'all and get to see some new friends and old friends and folks that I have known for a little bit. I think I was probably here last, maybe 2 years or so ago, when some of the elders from Alliance would come over and trying to help y'all with some of the transition, and we would fill in for preaching. And yeah, praise the Lord for what He's doing and what He has been doing the last couple months at your church. I thank the Lord for the faithful remnant of people who weathered the hard times and some of the storm. And for those who have started coming the last couple months, it's really fun to be here. So like Andrew said, I'm Mark Valentine. I work with a student organization called Crew at App State. I've been doing that at App State for 25 years, which is crazy. Was at NC State for a little bit before that as well. But so if you aren't around college students or on campus, you might not know this, but probably most folks in school this week starts to be really stressful for them. This week and the next week as they go through finals and get ready to wrap up the semester. And so we feel that working with college students for sure. That it gets to be a little bit of a stressor, abnormally stressful for them. And so we all get stressed. We all feel failure. We all feel rejection, but that's kind of first and foremost in their mind right now. Next couple weeks are especially hard. That's just not just college students. That's life in general in some ways. They'll figure that out after they graduate, that life doesn't get any easier in some ways. But if you aren't in school, you have your own sources of stress or circumstances that perhaps are really hard. Maybe it's finances or the fact that Christmas is coming, and that does some emotional things for a lot of folks. Family, relationships, maybe it's a lack of a relationship. Whatever it could be, most of us have, maybe are currently or will at some point experience some sort of frustration or circumstances that maybe feel like rejection, or you hear the word no. It feels maybe hopeless. So I'm not trying to make this evening or this morning hard, but reality is we live in a fallen, broken world, and life is hard at times. And I think some of the brokenness and disappointment that exists, I don't know if y'all are familiar with this, there's a new newish business that has sprung up in the last couple of years where you pay people money, and then you go in and they give you a hammer, sledgehammer or something, and you just smash things. Microwave ovens, windows, whatever, TVs. You pay a certain amount of money, you go in there, you break up everything, and then you leave, and that's supposed to help you feel better. That's what these folks do. And plates, TVs, appliances, they smash them in an attempt to feel better. I would hope that that's not how we're dealing with our frustrations or hearing the word no, or maybe facing some level of rejection. But I'm here this morning to tell you, you would know this, that there is a better way. Because of God's great love for us, He includes it in His guidebook for us, which is the Bible. And so we're going to be looking at a passage of Scripture. I'll explain a little bit where we're going to be. But even if you're not real familiar with the Bible or maybe Christianity, you've probably heard of the character we're going to be looking at named David. He became a king of Israel. He was probably the greatest king that Israel had. He's had some epic stories written about him, about David and the giant, David and Goliath. He's got more print in the Old Testament than any other Old Testament saint, which I didn't realize. So Abraham, which surprised me, I think only has about 14 chapters. That's a fairly small amount of the Old Testament when you think about everything. Moses has even less. David has over 60 chapters that are written about him, not even including some of the Psalms which he wrote, a lot of them. So nobody probably experienced more highs and lows than David did. He had pain from his own family, being anointed as king, and then living for 20 years as the most wanted man in Israel. I didn't realize this. Theologians say that when he was hiding from Saul in the caves of Adullam, which I just thought, he went into caves for like a weekend, kind of like a camping trip. They say he was in those caves for approximately 7 years. After he's been anointed king over Israel, he's living in a dark, hard cave for 7 years. We know about betrayal. He knows about battles. He knows about death. He knows about worship. He knows about killing giants. He did all of those things. And so it makes sense that he can give us some insight on what to do when perhaps we lose hope, or when things don't go your way, or dreams die, because David certainly experienced that. So we're going to look at how David responds. But first, I'll ask a couple questions to you all. What do you do when you pray for something and it doesn't happen? What do you do when you pray for something good and it doesn't happen? You might be praying for healing of a loved one. I prayed for 9 months that my dad would be healed of cancer, and it didn't happen the way I wanted it to. You might be praying for a new job, and yet you continue to get told, well, there's no place here for you to work. Maybe praying for a relationship. Maybe praying for parents not to divorce. We have friends who we know, we love them, they love each other, they're in a good marriage, they love God, and they've been praying for years for a baby. And month after month, they hear no. Some of y'all can probably relate to those kind of circumstances, and the pain is brutal. Like, reality is, it's just brutal. You can't compare levels of suffering. Whatever you're going through, it's still suffering to you, and that pain can be brutal. So what do you do when God says no? I think it's super challenging. It's one of the toughest things to walk through, especially when you feel like you've done everything right. You know, I think sometimes we have this mindset of, hey, I'm doing good things. I go to church. I proclaim Jesus to people that don't know him. I don't cheat on my spouse. I don't cheat on my taxes. I drive defensively. I read my Bible. I pray. I do all the good things that a Christian should be doing, and you're still going to tell no to me? Like, that just doesn't feel right. That isn't right, we might say. What about the verses that you say you reap what you sow? I've sowed good things, and I'm not reaping good things right now. And then I look around and I see other people who aren't reaping good things, and they seem to be reaping my dreams. What's going on, Lord? It might be where some of you are today. If not, you'll probably be there at some point. And it certainly is where David is when we pick up the text in 2 Samuel chapter 7, which is where we're going to be this morning. I love that the Bible's real. It's real people for real stuff. And so let's look at how we find hope in the midst of unfulfilled dreams. So you might not be super familiar with this chapter, but I think arguably it's one of the most important chapters in the Bible because it's the stage for the coming Messiah. This is where we first hear about all the stuff that we just read about and prayed about with Advent, and it's the songs that we sing this time of year is going back to 2 Samuel chapter 7. So what's going on? This chapter is so important because it sets the stage for the coming Messiah. And so at this point, you got to understand a little bit of the context. David has waged a civil war with the house of Saul for Israel, and David's won. So the war's over. He's crowned king. He's crowned king first in Hebron, and then he moves the capital to Jerusalem. So then he brings the ark of the Lord that's been at the tabernacle in Shiloh, and he brings it to Jerusalem. So that's his new capital. He's worshiping there. There's peace in the land. He's built this super nice palace where David lives, and things are good. So one day he's looking around, and he summons Nathan the prophet, and he says, hey, he has this interaction with Nathan the prophet. He says, hey, why am I living in this nice palace? When God, the Ark of the Covenant, is still being kept in this tent, the tabernacle. We brought that thing out of Egypt. We've used that tent when we were wandering around. It's now over 400 years old. Why is that? Why is God still residing in this tent when I'm living in the palace? So David has this dream, and I think this dream has been in David's life for a long time. But he has this dream to replace that old tent with this glorious temple in Jerusalem. And this is so critical to David. This is David's big dream. He sees that this temple could unite all the other countries, all the surrounding people, and let them see that the God of Israel is the God who rules all, that he is the one true God. Everything in David's life is leading up to this. This is why he thinks he's become king. This is my dream, and this is David's purpose. So he talks with the prophet Nathanael and explains what he wants to do. And Nathanael says, hey, that sounds good. Run with it. I think that's a good plan. Go ahead and do it. But that night, God appears in a dream to Nathan, the prophet. And we're going to pick up 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 5. Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, why have you not built a house for me of cedar? I think there's this, it's not maybe quite playful, but there's this interaction that takes place between David and the Lord through the prophet Nathan, where he says, hey, I've never lived in a house. I've never complained. Why would I want a cedar house when I own everything in the entire world? I have gold everywhere. God says, I don't need you to build a house for me. He actually says no to David's dream. He says, no, you're not going to be the one to build this temple for me. And it's not like, hey, no, like not right now. Maybe at some other point I'll get back to you. It's no forever, David. It's not happening. It's not going to be you. You aren't the one to build my house. And David's dreams, I think, crumble at that point. I think chapter 7 serves two purposes in the Bible. First, it gives us insight into the highs and lows of David's life. Everything in his life has been pointing to this moment, and everything that happens in David's life after this moment refers back to this point, this chapter. This chapter forever marks David, and we can learn a lot from what he does and how he responds. Secondly, the whole rest of the Bible refers back to this moment. Revelation refers back to this chapter multiple times. I think you could argue you can't understand Jesus and the rest of the Bible without understanding this chapter. So we're going to look at that later, but there's a question that comes up from that. Why does God say no to David? And why does he ever say no to us? We have to understand that God's reason sometimes, we have to understand the reason God sometimes says no is because God has a bigger perspective. He has a longer view than you and I do. We have 3 kids. They're older now. But I can remember pretty clearly the moment and the age, and some of you parents will remember this, when you moved your children out of the booster seat into their regular car seat. And I remember those times for a couple different reasons. One is because that's when the questions from the back seat really start happening. Because although our kids were super excited to get out of the booster seat, what they didn't realize was with this new freedom and new opportunity, it has some issues. One is now they're lower in the car and they can't see everything. They can't see out of the windows and they can't see out the front windows. They can't see over the seat in front of them. So they start asking questions constantly at this point. Where are we? Why are we stopping? Why aren't we going? Have we passed Harris Teeter yet? What was that noise? Was that a bus that just went by? Et cetera, et cetera. They just ask a ton of stuff. If I made the mistake, sometimes, Silas, our boy, I point out police cars or fire engines, and, when he's little and he wants to see them. He tries frantically to try and get taller and look out. He just can't do it because he's not tall enough to see, even though he has a frantic effort to try and get taller and get a better view, it doesn't work. The point is, my kids didn't have the perspective that I did looking out the car. When I was driving, I could see out the front and I could see all around, and I was the one driving. God has a bigger perspective than you and I do, and he is in control. He sees all the way into your future. He sees all the way into your past. He's got a bigger perspective and a more clear picture than you and I do. So look at what he says in verses 8 and 11. Think about this bigger perspective that I just talked about. He says this to Nathan the prophet. Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. God is contrasting here. He's saying, hey, this is what you've done. This is your perspective. You were shepherding sheep. I now have you shepherding my people. You can't compare what I'm going to do with you to what you have been doing. You used to tend sheep, now you will tend my people. Picking back up in verse 9, I have been with you wherever you have gone. I have cut off all your enemies from before you, and now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. And I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all of your enemies. And then look at this very last part of verse 11. God says, you aren't going to make a house for me. Instead, I'm going to make a house for you. Verse 11, the end of it. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. He goes on in 12, 13, and 14. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, think about that. That's that sign. None of us can see that day. None of us can see the day when we rest and are with our ancestors, but God can. He says, when that happens, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. At that point, I think he's talking about Solomon, but now he's going to make a shift in verse 13. He says, he is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. He's talking first about David's son Solomon, and then God announces that he has a better plan. Not only does he have a bigger perspective, he has a better plan. This is another reason why God says no. Not only does God say, hey, David, my perspective is more clear and far-reaching, but my plan is better than yours. He says, through your son Solomon, I'll have the temple built. Solomon built the first temple. But then God starts talking about another king who is coming. Verse 16, your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. You have to know this is a different king and a different kingdom and a different throne. God says, hey, in these verses, he says it's going to endure forever and ever. We know that David's earthly dynasty barely lasts 100 years. Civil war comes again, strips him of his kingdom. Israel's divided again. So that can't be what God's talking about here. But he says, hey, there's an offspring who will come, who will rule forever, and his kingdom will never end. I will be his father, and he will be my son. We read this, and we read the Advent story, we read the Christmas story, and we're like, oh yeah, that's perfect. Makes good sense. God, that is a better plan. David didn't have all that. David didn't know any of that. We know that there's an offspring who will come, who will rule forever. We know that. But David didn't. It didn't make sense to David. We have the advantage of looking back and seeing God's plan played out. David never had that. He didn't know any of this stuff because it was in the future. But these two verses were all that David got. David never got the who, the what, the how. God said, David, no, you're not going to build my temple. You're not going to build my house. After you die, I'm going to do some really good things, but you're not going to know what they are because you'll be dead. That's hard. That's hard to hear. Your dreams aren't going to happen. It's not going to happen. God has a better plan, but that doesn't mean he has to explain it to you or to me. Some things in life will never be explained, and some things in my life will never change. And you got to ask for wisdom to understand that. You got to ask for God's grace and wisdom to understand that. David could have stomped his feet. He could have gone and paid some entrepreneur in Jerusalem to let him go in and smash a bunch of plates and destroy a bunch of things like people want to do now. He could have rebelled. He could have stopped trusting. He could have turned to other things. He could have walked away from his faith like a lot of people do. Some people do, but he didn't. Look at what David does do. Verse 18. Nathan tells him, hey, this isn't going to happen. Your dream of building this house for the Lord isn't going to happen. And it says David went in and he sat down and he prayed. I think this is significant. Don't miss this. Where did he go? In that day, to go before the Lord, like the text says, you went to the tabernacle. So David goes into the old tent that he wanted to replace, and he sat. That word sat is the same word used earlier in verse 1 when it's translated settled. It's the same word. It's that idea of, hey, this wasn't like a short 10-second quick prayer. This is David, and he's settling his body. He's sitting. He's settling his mind, and he prays. And as he prays, his heart becomes settled. He's doing what he wrote about in Psalm 37, be still and know that I am God. So that's what David did. And because of that, it gets him to a place where I think he needed to be in light of this dream not happening. He does three things that we're going to look at. I'm going to mention them, but just because I mention them, don't think that these three things will necessarily take away pain and disappointment. I don't think it would be fair to say David wasn't still disappointed, but he trusted the Lord, and he did a couple things to help with that. One of the things he did was he thinks of God's grace to him. Verses 18 and 22. And I would encourage you, in the midst of hardship and disappointment, try and think of God's grace to you. Verses 18, he says, who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family, that you have brought me this far? David realizes that everything he has is from God, and it's the same for us. That hasn't changed. Your breath, the breath that you just took, the breath that you just inhaled right now as I'm speaking is a gift of God's grace. The fact that you exist is a gift of God's grace. Any friends, any skills, any talents, they're all blessings that you have because of God's grace. Don't obsess on what you don't have in light of what you do have. And David had to get to that point, but it's hard. 2 Samuel, the last part of 18, David asked this question, do you deal with everyone this way, sovereign Lord? What more can I say to you? He's basically saying, you know what your servant is really like. Sovereign Lord, because of your promise and according to your will, you have done all these great things, not because of what I have done, but because you wanted to do it. And then you made them known to your servant. How great you are, O sovereign Lord. David has changed. His perspective has changed fairly quickly. We don't know the time he's in there, but it's changed. He's basically saying, hey, there's no one like you. We've not even heard of any God like you before. Nobody's heard of a God that operates like this. He says that, and I think we miss this because, again, we've got 2,000 more years of history and the Bible and the revelation that comes with that. But David didn't have that. He says, hey, we've never even heard of another God like you, because in this day and age when David writes this, it was typical. If you wanted something from a God, little g, you would do something to earn their favor. You would build a temple for them. You would do something to get something from God. There's a temple in Egypt built by Thutmose III to his god Ra. And as it's been found, it was completed. The priest at that time of Ra wrote this on the wall of the temple. It says, Thutmose III, since you have built my dwelling place and you have outstripped all other kings in building my monuments, now I will establish your throne into distant days. Thutmose did something to earn his little g God's favor. That's what people do often. That's what they certainly did then. Sadly, it's often what we still do now. This isn't just an Old Testament theology. This is echoed in Ephesians 2 when Paul says, hey, you've been saved by grace through faith, not by works. Everybody else back then is like, hey, I'm going to do something. I'm going to work really hard so that I'll get the favor of my God. Ephesians 2 and this verse in 2 Samuel chapter 7 says that's not how it works. You don't do things necessarily for me to earn my favor. I do things for you, And as a result, that motivation changes your heart. Faith isn't primarily about you doing something for God. It's about sitting in wonder, and then out of gratitude for what he's done, you do good works. It's the opposite of how the world operates. Motivation comes from knowledge of what God has already done for us. And so David is sitting in that, and he says, hey, in light of what you've done, in light of all the good things you've done for me, my life should proclaim that. My life, my works shall reflect your grace to me. Not I'm going to do those works to earn your favor. The next two things that David do are maybe a little bit harder, but pick up in verse 25. David says, I am your servant. David knew who was God and he knew who wasn't God. Sometimes we still get that confused. He learns to thank God when he says no. Lots of time God says no to what seems like legitimate or good things. Moses asks, hey, can I go into the promised land? No. The demon-possessed man who's been saved from the demons and the bondage and the chains, the people despise him. They're mad at him now because they've destroyed the economy and all the pigs have run off the cliff. He's like, Jesus, can I come with you? And Jesus says, no, you got to stay here. Jesus says, Father, take this cup from me. God says no. Paul needed healing and asked for the thorn in his side to be removed, and God says no. If God said no to Moses, Paul, and Jesus, he might say no to you and me. It's just reality. But no can be God's greatest gift. You know, as a flawed, sinful parent, who I try to be loving and good and caring, but I tell my children no. How much more so would a perfectly loved, good, caring father say no to protect and guide his children? I said this earlier. If I didn't say no to Silas, our youngest son, he'd probably be learning how to juggle with chainsaws and throwing rocks at things all the time. I've got to tell him no. But no can lead to blessing and keeps you from harm. The third thing David does is he trusts God with his future. Verses 28 and 29. He says, Sovereign Lord, you are God. Your covenant is trustworthy, and you have promised these good things to your servant. Now be pleased to bless the house of your servant, that it may continue forever in your sight. Don't miss this. David says, for himself, I think he says it because he needs to get in that right place, but he also says it for you and for me. Learn like he did, that you can benefit from this. When he says, God, Sovereign Lord, you have spoken, and with your blessing, the house of your servant will be blessed forever. You see the wisdom of this? Lots of people never get to this. David is saying, hey, with your blessings, I will be blessed. I'm going to choose to be blessed by the blessing that God gives you. And this promise, this blessing that God gives him is a universal theme and an ongoing promise that the rest of the Bible is about. That promise about your kingdom being eternal is the blessing that now blesses us. And David is saying, I have to be content with that. It's not the blessing that I thought I was going to get with the temple, but it's a better blessing. This is what we celebrate at Advent today. One day there will be someone from David's line who will become the Savior of the world. As that is understood, as David understands that, expectations grow and grow and grow for the people of Israel. They dreamed of this child that was going to come, this root of Jesse, this heir of David who will have an eternal throne. They wrote poetry about him. Unto us a child is born, unto us a child is given, and the government will be upon his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. He will reign on David's throne forever. That's the hope that they had. That's the hope that we have. But that promise came at a cost to David. The people can't wait for this to take place. 1,000 years after David, an angel appears and says to this Jewish girl named Mary, you will have a son. He will be great. He will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. That's that promise again. And he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end. That's the promise in 2 Samuel chapter 7. The angel paraphrases that. And then one day later, that same child proclaimed to Mary is going to be cheered by massive crowds. They're going to call out, "Hosanna to the Son of David." They expected him to be the one to kick out the Romans and answer their prayer, and God says no to their good dream. God allows Rome to execute his son because he has a bigger perspective and a better plan, just like he had with David. This chapter is so important for all those reasons that we've already mentioned. Plus, we're supposed to see these similarities that exist between David and this eternal king that's going to come, that's mentioned. David defeated the Philistines. By his sacrifice, David defeated death and sin. By his sacrifice, Jesus defeated death and sin. David brought peace to Israel. Jesus brought peace to all mankind. In Revelation 22:16, Jesus will declare from his eternal throne, "I am the root and offspring of David." That's why we have 2 Samuel chapter 7. It's there to remind us that God has a bigger perspective and a better plan, and that you can trust him. Will you trust him in the midst of hard things? Will you trust him when you perhaps hear no to what seems like a really good dream, a really good prayer? It won't always be easy, but I'm so grateful that we can learn from the saints of old and trust our God who has always remained faithful.